Good afternoon. I'm Wendy Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Tri-Faith Initiative, and I'm so grateful that you all are taking time to join us for this conversation today. Welcome. If you don't know, I flew to New York this morning because over the last 2 years, I have had the good fortune to come into friendship with a group of interfaith women from across the globe. And I'm going to be real honest. We came together because women need to hear each other's voices. And we came together to learn about how we might respond to a growing trend in sexual harassment within the interfaith movement. And this weekend, we are gathering for lunch together for the first time. And Azza and I are in this group together, and we're going to have lunch with a few of our other friends on Saturday. But it just so happened that we picked the weekend to do that luncheon on the same weekend that Azza and I had agreed to already have this conversation. So I moved the date back a little bit so that we could do this in person, because we've never done a Tri-Faith event live from New York before. So thank you for joining. It's exciting to see that we have audience from coast to coast and Canada and Europe. So I think the other thing that's really important for us all to note this morning is that the organization that Azza is with is called Religions for Peace. And what a great reminder this morning for us to take a minute and to give some prayer for peace. Our world needs us to pause and remember to pray that lives are spared and that we can find a peaceful resolution to the pain that is in our world. So let's just take a moment to send that energy. Thank you. Thank you. Today's a heavy day. So knowing that we can come together to learn from each other and learn about the work that is being done to promote and cultivate spaces for understanding and relationship is why we're going to have this conversation today. So Azza, thank you for being here with me.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming all the way to New York so we can have this opportunity to be in person. I think given the COVID thing, it's very special to finally be together.
Can you hear Azza? Do we need her to speak up a little bit? We're good. Okay. Tell us. Let's start with, I really love it when Krista Tippett starts with, tell me about the spirituality of your childhood. So I'm going to go with that. How about if you tell us your spiritual background?
So my spiritual background is same as my religious one, which is as a Muslim. I'm born, bred, very much a believer, but it seems to me more and more that the way that my spiritual background prepared me isn't necessarily what I see happening in the name of so much of my faith around me today. Some of it is for sure, but much of it isn't. I was taught, for instance, that Islam is all about respect and appreciation for the fact that everyone is a believer, and that Islam is about believing first and foremost, and about giving in to the will of the Almighty, which means that no one religion is better than the other. No one is chosen more than the other. That's what I was taught. Increasingly, the rhetoric that I heard as I grew up, and especially these days, is much more polarizing than that. But that spirituality of oneness with all who believe, and it doesn't have to be believe in the same thing. It's not believe in God, or whatever, but believe in a greater power, if you will. That's the spirituality of my childhood, and that very much is the spirituality I live with today.
And what called you into this work about that? Or tell us just the path, how you got here. The more interesting version of me reading your CV.
Which might not be interesting at all, actually. But so let me try to make it a little bit more interesting in the sense of also more true because it's not going to be on the CV. But I remember as a young child in the late 60s and early 70s, witnessing my mother's sister, who was a very, very strong-willed, still is, by the way, very strong-willed woman, very independent, being thrown out by her husband once he divorced her with the kids, and ultimately ending up losing a child who was burned. And watching that and being part of that pain and the anguish of a woman who was not loved because she was very, very strong-willed. And then observing how, even though the home she was thrown out of was hers legally, but because the man had the right to the property, her husband, even when he divorced her, got the home. And so observing the legality issues at a time when, at that point in Egypt, there was a great deal of debate about the rights in religion versus the rights in law, and the tension between the two. And of course, given a situation where it's not a democratic country, it's not a democratically elected regime. So how do laws then get imposed or even formulated or not? And how that impacted directly on her, because the law gave her husband the right to take her home and throw her and the children out literally onto the streets. And so just growing up through that process, which was very personal to us because she was my aunt, but it was also happening in millions of other households around the country. And so growing up in the midst of those contentions about faith, rights, legislation, governance, democracy, because it was all interconnected, was what made me very curious about, wait, if God is just and according to Islam, she should have that right to her own property, which is actually what Sharia says, then why is this woman out looking for somewhere to be with her children and ultimately losing one of her children? My parents were not in Egypt at that time, so she wasn't able to access our home. But I do recall wondering about those questions. And wait a minute, why is it that the law says something that is not what the religion says, even though this is a country that claims to be religious? And then seeing how the religious actors themselves had different opinions about what was religious and what wasn't religious. And seeing the political actors pretend to know more than the religious actors and use the religious actors and pit them against each other. All of that I grew up in. And so it made me just very fascinated by the connection between law, governance, and human rights, quite frankly. So that's where this whole thing started. My interest in understanding that relationship between rights, faith, and good governance.
So Religions for Peace International. There is Religions for Peace USA also.
Yes.
Can you create what each container is and how you partner?
Yes, I like the idea of the container. So Religions for Peace is like, how the United Nations has 193 governments, is composed of 190. Okay, so Religions for Peace has 100 religious and faith institutions and faith communities. So it's the UN of religious institutions, if you will. And that's also why we're right here facing the UN itself, because that relationship, there's a very strong symbiosis between the political institutions and the religious institutions. The idea of this space is that just as the United Nations is meant to bring governments together to secure peace for the world, as we can see, the idea was also very much and still remains to bring the religious actors, religious institutions, and faith leaders together to support that mission of ensuring world peace. And as we can all see, both sides are doing swimmingly well. And we're in that space where ironically, the UN has been around for more than 75 years. Religions for Peace has been around for more than 52 years. And you can see that the need for that peace has only grown in that time. So both institutions could certainly do a lot better in terms of how they can ensure that their members, whether they are governments or religious institutions, actually will make peace possible. that's the quintessential objective of religions for peace. So you could also argue and say, well, the UN is not really doing a good job, and neither is Religions for Peace. So both institutions are defunct, but actually no. Because if you didn't have these institutions, we need to build them now anyway. You need the spaces that insist on convening people in spite of war and in spite of what seems to be the determination to have war, to make war with one another. And unfortunately, historically, human beings have always had the religious at the root of the political, and the political as part of the religious. So when we see the political misbehave, we know that the religious is also misbehaving, actually. So both institutions are necessary. Both institutions have to work together and do, and that's what Religions for Peace does. We work with the United Nations on a whole bunch of issues, including the humanitarian issues. But therefore, we exist in different countries, like the UN. The UN has country presence, national presence. Unlike many other organizations, it's important to not just be in a headquarter in one part of the world and look at the globe, but it's important to be part of the countries in question. So Religions for Peace USA is the US affiliate of Religions for Peace International. We are also in 95 other countries and 4 regions of the world. And we do as well as our members allow us to serve them.
Tell us how people are brought into leadership in Religions for Peace and how Religions for Peace is funded.
So religious institutions, whether it's the Vatican or the Anglican Communion or the various Jewish communities around the world, and Hindu and Buddhist and Sikh and Jain, and you name it, including indigenous, nominate their representatives to serve on the board of Religions for Peace every 5 years. Whenever there's an assembly, there is also a process of nomination and election that takes place. So in the same way that the UN government will be there on the council, Religions for Peace's religious institution members nominate their representatives to sit on our board. So as an officer, I have very little say in who gets to be on my board. But whoever they are, I know that they're nominated and formally elected to serve in their position, and they are beholden to and responsible to their own religious institution or faith community.
Interesting. Start to hold your questions. We definitely will have time for some questions. So, but not quite yet. I still have a few more. So back to the question of how is your work funded?
Yes. So we are funded by the same way that the UN is funded. Some governments give us funding based on specific projects or initiatives that they wish to see religious communities engage in, but also foundations. Very, very little money comes in through individual donations from anyone who sees the work and is willing. That's usually the stream of things.
And where is the place between the work, the accountability between the UN and Religions for Peace? Are you called into meetings together?
So we agree on specific projects and initiatives that we will do together with different UN. The UN is a massive universe. So we have agreements with a number of different UN entities like UNICEF, the Children's Fund, like UNHCR, the Refugee Agency, like UNOHCHR, the Human Rights Entity. We have specific agreements to do specific initiatives with them. And as with any agreement, here's what we're each going to be responsible to do, and here's the time we will do this in, etc. So it's bound by that mutual agreement around that. So it's not a permanent marriage, thank heavens. It's based on specific issues at specific points in time that we work with specific UN entities on. So for instance, with the World Health Organization, at the outbreak of COVID, we reached out to suggest that perhaps the leadership of WHO would like to consult with different religious institutions and religious leaders, and may have something to make as an ask of them. Because if you recall, at the very beginning of the COVID, there was so much concern about misinformation around how the disease is transmitted, what this virus looks like, what we should do, what we should not do. There was a great deal of angst, especially within certain religious communities and certain religious leaders. So it was it was an opportune moment to have a direct interaction between the scientists and the medical personnel of WHO who were responsible for the world health, and between these religious leaders who are responsible for everything else, including world health, by the way. So we have had a series of consultations at different national levels where different religious institutions are convened by WHO officials and entities in order to make sure that the right scientific information and evidence is there, but also to hear from these religious communities what some of their concerns were. And this relationship continues now with the vaccine dynamics that we all know can be quite interesting, to put it mildly.
So what's a lesson that you've learned during COVID related to your relationship with the World Health Organization as well as the religious communities? Have there been any wins or tragic losses? I mean, we know the tragic losses is lives, but things that really disappointed you or you really celebrated?
I think what I celebrated is the fact that there was this long, because when I served in the UN before I joined Religions for Peace 2 years ago, I also served within the United Nations system for about 20 years. And my work there was on trying to get the value of religion and religious institutions to be understood, appreciated, and integrated into the UN's engagement. So that it's not only with governments, it's not only with secular civil society, it's not only with the private sector, but also with religious institutions and service actors. And it was a very hard struggle. Those 20 years were difficult because the attitude within the United Nations at that time when I started in 2004 was, we don't do religion. And one of the things that I guess is worthy of celebration now is to see how HIV/AIDS, then Ebola, and now COVID has made it very difficult to ignore what the role of different religious institutions, religious leaders is, especially since we know that the bulk of primary healthcare in most parts of the world is actually provided by and through religious actors. Even here in the United States, 70% of the hospitals are run through the Catholic Church. So the idea that you can do health but not do religion is a bit odd and is quite frankly very blind. And so to see that understanding now finally become okay, yes, okay, so we do need to reach out to the religious communities. We need religious leaders to be able to know what the scientific evidence is so that they can articulate it to the communities, that they unparalleled outreach that religious institutions have. It's unparalleled. No other NGO has the kind of outreach that any church community or synagogue or temple anywhere in the world has, actually. So it was important to see that, and it's very good to see that there's this awareness that religions now have a very critical role to play, different kinds of religious institutions, religious actors, and religious NGOs. It would be nice if these secular entities could discern between the religious institutions, religious NGOs. It would be nice if they could have some discernment between them, but that might be something we need to work on for another couple of decades. But in principle, very happy to see that awareness take shape. I think the most disappointing thing for me, ironically, has been the way that the religious actors themselves, and here I speak specifically about religious institutions, how they themselves seem to be reacting to the attention from secular politicians, secular governments, to them, the attention to them. So now they are more sought after. They are invited to be at important decision-making tables and spaces. And naive, foolish me assumed that understanding that they're now important, that they're now listened to, would translate into, let's all go together and say what needs to be said, right? Together. Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Christian, Buddhist, and my goodness, look at the power of that. But let's do this together, guys. And instead I realized, wait, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the individual religious leaders, individual religious institutions are trying to benefit from this limelight for themselves, for their own institution, and for their own religious interests, as opposed to everyone's interests, the common good. So to see some religious leaders behave like politicians has been a bit jarring, but that's because I'm naive and foolish. It isn't because of anything new that's happening. It's just that I was really hoping we could see that coming together as faith actors more and realize, wait a minute, they're part of the polarization, of the political polarization that's taking place, and more interest in them has translated into, let's seize this opportunity to affirm our own institution and or our own NGO.
So I'm curious, we are hearing quite a bit, or I'm reading quite a bit about a shifting religious landscape in the United States, away from a connection with affiliation, not necessarily away from being spiritual but not religious, is that term that we're hearing often. On a global stage, I'm hearing that movement is not as quick away from affiliation, that the religious institutions are maintaining their strength and growing their communities. Do you have so that people are moving away from institutionalized religion in the United States, but not on a global stage, that faith is growing and affiliation is growing on a global stage. So is that correct, or how would you speak to that?
Okay, so it's slightly more nuanced, because I think the move away from institutionalized religion is actually a global phenomenon, right? And it's part of the reason why religious institutions are even more keen, I won't say desperate, but even more keen on safeguarding their institutional space. And therefore, when they get the attention from the rest of the power spaces around the world, they try to seize that moment for the institution's benefit, precisely because religious institutions are losing ground globally. And the worst example of this, like, it's not a good example, but it's like a worst case example of this, is to see how there are terrorists and extremists who will do and die for their religious beliefs, but they're not affiliated to any institution. In fact, they're anti the very same institutions that are supposed to uphold their religious values. So the movement away from institutions is that extreme, that you'll find people doing things in the name of their religion which have absolutely nothing to do with the values upheld by the religious institutions of the same religion. So yes, that movement of disinstitutionalization, or whatever it is indeed global. But I think what we see is the difference between what's happening within, say, Abrahamic faith traditions, because the institutions have a much more prominent role in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's more of an institutional emphasis in these religions, within Buddhism, within Hinduism, within Jainism and Sikhism, and to a certain extent, even within Islam itself. There isn't really like a one institutional body that you can track and see how many people are either flocking to or away from. So it's much more difficult to make that trend. So where you have large communities of non-Christians, it's harder to see that trend of disinstitutionalization or distance from an institutionalized religion. But it is happening in so many cases. And even where you don't have an institutionalized space, you can see where, for instance, in the Hindu tradition, where some Hindu gurus or some Buddhist leaders are losing some of their members, but it's not that Buddhism or Hinduism is on the decline. It's just that these particular actors, for whatever reason, are not as central as they used to be before. People are growing more disenchanted, especially young people are growing more disenchanted with centralized religion.
Fascinating. Let's shift to talk about the 97 interreligious councils.
Yep.
What does that mean?
Okay, so the whole principle of Religions for Peace is that you need to make sure that religious actors and faith actors are coming together. They're coming together, they're working together, they speak together, they do things together, etc. So therefore, when they do so, that is an interreligious council. It's a platform that, and usually legally registered platform, that brings together the representatives of those religious and faith communities together. And we have 97 of those, because those are 97 countries where
where Religions for Peace exists. So how does it exist? It exists as an interreligious council, basically.
And give us an example of a project that the Interreligious Council in the United States is working on.
So yes, that was the Religions for Peace USA that you began asking
yes.
you. So that Religions for Peace USA is the Interreligious Council here in the United States. They've been doing quite a lot of work. The thing that comes close to me, because I don't know what all 97 of them are doing,
Sure.
to be honest, but what I know from our Interreligious Council of the US is that they did a whole series of webinars after at the height of the Trump administration's discourse on the treatment of certain religious minorities here in the United States, on anti-Semitism, on Islamophobia, on racism. They convened a wide number of actors, not just religious, but in a way to bring the conversations about what was going on here in the US that was causing so much grief and pain at the spiritual level, but very much also on the legal legislative level. So there was a massive awareness raising campaign that they undertook together, and they did it as Religions for Peace USA, but Religions for Peace USA is the Lutheran Church and the Catholics and everyone else who's there as religious institutions in the US. So they were all doing it. So it was hard to see whether this is actually Religions for Peace USA or this is the American Jewish Community and the World Jewish Service, or whether this was the Catholic Bishops' Conference, because they were all actually working on this together.
If you could change something about how that collaboration is working, what is something you would change?
So I'll speak more on the global level.
Okay.
I think we're living right smack in day 2 of a war that's taking place on the borders of Europe, and I think it's been a journey to get here and to see how reticent some religious voices have been about saying anything as slowly things developed, but also to see how one of the largest and oldest religious institutions in the world, which is the Orthodox churches, to see how divided, how the political and military have created a division amongst and within that church, and to see how the rest of our religious world is observing and thinking, some of them thinking, well, this is Europe and this is just the Orthodox, and not realizing that this is about the fracture of the human spirit above all, and that each has a role to play in making sure that fracture doesn't take place, and in trying to heal that fracture. I wish I could see our faith leaders and institutions come together for the sake of one and all, rather than be as polarized as the politicians themselves are, and defer to the political and military space in ways that I sometimes wish they wouldn't do. But that is, I think, the ideal that we would strive for. It isn't necessarily the reality that we have.
And are there spaces for diplomacy that the politicians are calling religious actors in?
So when I think it was last year, we did a global conference on faith and diplomacy, and we made sure it was intergenerational. So we had different generations of people talking to one another. And one of the things that came out very clearly was how the religious leaders were saying to the diplomats, the secular diplomats from different ministries of foreign affairs, saying, you think you guys are the only diplomats in town, but actually we're the oldest diplomats ever, because we've always been running communities, and the oldest empires were religious in nature, and the oldest relationships between different people were run by religious actors, actually. So hello, we do diplomacy and have done so for centuries. So very nice to meet you. How are you? And how's your diplomacy going these days? I mean, I'm obviously making a caricature, but it was so interesting to see the religious leaders saying, what, you think you're diplomats? You're the only diplomats. We're the diplomats, the original ones. So that was one thing that I think I was very, yeah, when you think about it, it makes perfect sense, but we don't normally think about it. You could see the expression on so many of these diplomats' faces, the traditional diplomats from foreign affairs and state and so on, feeling as if, wait, what? No, this, what we do is diplomacy, what you guys do. Yeah, well, okay. So interesting, eye-opening moment, if you will, for all sides, but for sure, what I think is happening now is that so many religious actors, political regimes, I should say, political regimes, north, south, east, west, around the world, are seeing, some of them have seen for many centuries, the value added of using religion to make the case of the political legitimacy, to undergird a particular persona. So religion has been the oldest used tool.
So when you say religion has been the tool, do you mean theology?
And culture, because religions are part of so many cultures. There's no culture that exists devoid of religion, by the way. Indigenous culture is faithful culture to the nth degree. So yes, religious and cultural, theology and culture, practice of human beings living together has always been informed by different religious dynamics. And yes, politicians make use of that left, right, and center. This country is not averse to that happening as well.
So I often think of the words belief, behavior, and belonging when I think about how I express my Judaism. And if I'm thinking about diplomacy and feeling that what's happening in this moment is happening really far away, what is it that you think as a leader in a religious movement that my belief, behavior, or belonging could do to impact this moment of pain that we're in? Me as an individual, us as a movement of tri-faith, the community of people who have showed up here today. What can we do?
So actually quite a number of things, but let's start at when you began our conversation, you said, let's take a moment to reflect and think about or pray for, whatever the terminology is, those who are being impacted at this very, very moment in some very harmful ways. And I think taking that time to reflect together, whether in silence or actually to debate and to learn more and to figure things out more with one another as individuals, is extremely valuable, is seriously undervalued. We tend to think, well, it's, let me just think of the day and the here and the now. I'm in the office now and I need to get this done and I need to, and then there's the family. But actually sitting down and trying to understand and unpack what's just been happening, what is actually unfolding around us, that may seem like it's so far away. But remember, the Second World War was started by someone killing someone in Sarajevo. And we have a Second World War that cost millions of lives, and that one particular religious community suffered immensely from, correct? A Holocaust. So nothing is ever really that far away. That what we're seeing happen today, the politics of our world is so incredibly interconnected that nothing is only over there. Iraq wasn't only over there. Afghanistan wasn't only over there. We suffered it here. We elected, and our own electoral politics, our own legislation today in terms of the electoral gerrymandering that's happening is related and interconnected to what our government that we elected has made decisions to do or not to do, and is able to do or not to do, because we are the citizens thereof. So the interconnectedness is far more profound than we actually pause to reflect on. And therefore the pause to reflect on that and what the implications of this are now and can be are extremely integral to us. Will it only matter to me if I know that there are, say, Muslims in Ukraine who are being killed at the moment, or who are being polarized because they're on different sides of the divide? Will that only make it matter to me? No, it matters to me right now. Why? Because the ramifications of that is exactly like putting a massive stone right smack in the middle of a small pond. That small pond is our world. And that massive stone that has been thrown in, the ripples thereof are quite extensive, and they do touch upon our lives. So when I see what's happening in say, the Ukraine and Russia, I see what's going on also in the context of the church and what's happening within the church and the relationships between the Orthodox churches and one another, but also the relationships between them and other people of faith in different parts of the world. So I see an interconnectedness on so many different levels: political, social, moral, economic, you name it. And I think we need to pause to understand what those massive waves that come from that stone that's being dropped, or I really never get the terminology right, but what are those implications potentially like for us? What will it mean for our kids in school if there's a Russian and a Ukrainian descendants who are in the same school and in the same class as my child, for instance? But it's also more diverse than that. There are implications. Let's be ready for them, because at a minimum, it means that there are people who are now killing one another in some part of the world, and our world is not that disconnected. But I think also at a maximum, there is the issue of being able to reflect for how we can influence our respective legislators to play a different role, to assess and see how did we ever anticipate that the exit from Afghanistan would land us with so many refugees today, who many of us are busy trying to see how we can support and serve in this country. No, we didn't actually think of that before, but perhaps we should have. So let's think and see what the implications of this really mean. Even if it means more refugees in Europe, what are the ramifications of that for the Europeans? More interesting for people like myself who are always looking at the interfaith dynamics is, we know, for instance, that it's not only the Orthodox Church, but it's also the relationship. The Orthodox Church exists also in Turkey. Turkey is a very powerful regional player in the Middle East dynamics. What the relationship between Turkey and Israel, between Turkey and Saudi Arabia? What are some of those? Because Turkey is now deeply worried about it's right. In a way, it's there. It's impacted by this. What are the dominoes that are going to be falling over one another as a result of that? I'm interested in that because I'm looking at the geopolitical and religious dynamics and of this, but each one of us has a different stake in this conflict and in any conflict that is taking place. But once it reaches the level of armed conflict between nuclear folks, that's when I get particularly worried too. And I think we all should.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a question here from Noreen about the mention that you made about youth specifically moving away from institutionalized religion. Her question is, what does that mean for the future of organized religion, and how does it impact religious leaders who are losing power or control?
So it's a very good question. I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not a universal phenomenon. It's not happening in the same rate and in the same way across all religions. So there are different implications. Because it's not universal, it's also impossible to give a universal answer. But what I can say, I think, is that one of the implications is what I shared already, which is that you see how some of these religious institutions who are experiencing the growing disenchantment of some of their youth, I'm putting it very politely, how some of these religious institutions become more, on the one hand, more interested in their own existence and survival, and there are implications of how they start behaving within their own communities. But there's also a positive side, which I think you'll see in certain communities. I won't name any, but you see how some of the religious institutions are trying to take more responsibility and be more accountable to that which is not going very well, to the mistakes, the errors, the pain that is being caused and has been caused. And I think that also is worthy of note. So we can't only see it as a negative phenomenon of flight. We also have to see what is taking place within these religious institutions that's making them transform towards the better, right? It's also a moment of reckoning. You can look at it in terms of, oh, they're losing power, or you can look at it in terms of there are going to be those within them who will do their best to now adjust, to do better, to serve better, to be better institutions for their communities. So those two things happen at the same time. That's why it's impossible to predict a flight away only, but we have to look at how it's leading to an evolution of an institutional makeup. It's leading to an eventual transformation in how these religious institutions are relating to communities and serving them in different ways. And hopefully, it might actually also be leading to a context where so many of the youth who are disaffected are also holding these institutions accountable in different ways and being able to do so collectively. So many of the Interfaith Youth Network members in Religions for Peace's networks, for instance, and we saw this in the interfaith dialogue that we did on faith and diplomacy that I was just referring to, we saw how they're not pleased with their institutions, in fact, but they want to have the conversation with them to hold them accountable. And they want to have the say, and they see that it's because they're so upset or so disenchanted or so disappointed, it makes them more, it gives the youth a bit more energy, some of the youth a bit more energy to be more courageous in holding their religious leader accountable. Why did you do that? Why did that happen? How could you let that happen? And even though it's an uncomfortable conversation, it's actually a very necessary one, both for the youthful believer, for other believers, but also for those who are holding the reins of power in those institutions, to have those uncomfortable conversations with the youth. So disaffection or disappointment is also an opportunity for transformation and accountability. And I think that's what we're seeing around the world. So that's why it's almost impossible to predict, here's what it will lead to in only one direction.
Mm-hmm. I was at an Omaha Chamber annual meeting this last week, and there was a woman who spoke, Carla Harris, from losing the name of the financial firm that she works for, but she was talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she was speaking about the millennials in the workplace in this very similar way, holding those in positions of power to be able to bring your intersectional identity into the workplace. And we are certainly seeing in this great resignation and shifting work realities, that this idea of, an EAP, the idea that you might be able to go get a couple hours of counseling, that's not enough to create spiritual wellness or make you feel that you belong, right? And so it's interesting to watch the different sectors grapple with the concept of belonging, and this concept that is clearly global. And so the virus taught us how interconnected we are. But it will be interesting to see where the silver linings come of what we learn about our interconnectedness in each of these lanes that have all the dominoes. More questions than answers. One of my other questions was, are there models of social cohesion that you've witnessed that you feel work?
Oh my goodness, yes. So one of the things we did in 2020, April 2020, immediately after, you remember that March was when WHO declared that this is a global pandemic. In April 2020, Religions for Peace set up a multi-religious humanitarian fund, because we noticed that all the religious institutions, who are the original humanitarian entities, by the way, everywhere in the world, we noticed that all of them were working at 1,000 and 100% to serve and deliver, but they were each working separately. And of course, they're massive institutions. So when they work separately, it's a tremendous amount of work. So it's not about the amount of work, but it is the quality of that work in terms of the fact that rather than work together to serve the exact same communities in the exact same countries who are suffering the exact same concerns, they were each working to serve separately. So we set up the fund with the intention of saying, do you think perhaps possibly, maybe you could consider working together? Just a tiny amount of resources that would induce you to do one of those things that you're each doing separately, or do together. How's that? And it was interesting because two things happened. First of all, we realized that the religious institutions, the more established and wealthy they were, and religious NGOs, the more established and wealthy they were, the less inclined they were to really take a little bit peanuts to do anything together. And the idea was, we're serving everybody anyway. Why do we have to coordinate more? It's absolute hell to coordinate ourselves. You think we're going to take a little bit of peanuts in order to coordinate more? Forget it. You don't know what you're talking about. So that was one reaction. But the other reaction was to see how, and this goes to the point again about religious institutions and individuals, how it was the youth and the women of faith in different communities who are like, yes, absolutely. Here's what we want to do. Here's what we need support for. And here's who we are. We're Jewish, we're Muslim, we're Hindu, we're Jain, whatever the composition of that particular country was, they submitted the proposal. So over 90% of the proposals we received were from not religious institutions, but obviously religiously affiliated youth and women's networks who were anyway working and volunteering and certainly would appreciate the support to do more of this work together. So that was perhaps the most encouraging thing ever, is to see how institutions are slower to respond, for sure, but it's the young and the young women who are the agents of transformation and service through service in their communities. And so they continue to inspire, and in some cases, in some countries, especially, but not only in Eastern Europe and in some Asian countries, the work that they did was so good and actually managed to attract some media attention that the religious leaders were like, yes, oh my goodness, yes, absolutely. We've been there all along. We're very proud of these folks. We're there. They're part of us. Yes, absolutely, they're part. But they weren't doing anything before. But it was lovely to see how that catalyzed an interest, because now it's media, it's attention, which says a lot, by the way, about the role of media everywhere in the world, especially in the realms of religion. But that was where the inspiration continues to come from. To be honest, it's the young women and young men and. Those are the communities that are not necessarily always institutionally bound, but the faith is the ties that bind to the faith are stronger than the ties that bind to the institution. Mm-hmm. And those are the people who will then create those webs of collaboration and service in their communities. Yes, absolutely inspired.
That's beautiful. Farah, it feels like you have a question. I guess you sent to me direct message, but we just spoke a little bit. Could you unmute yourself and add on to what else you would like to be addressed? Are you comfortable with that, Farah?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Sorry, because I'm working from home as well. I'm trying to focus as much as I can on the conversation, which is fascinating. And I appreciate Dr. Azza Karam. I always try to make sure that I attend any of these dialogues and parts of the programs that she's part of. So yeah, I think I addressed it to you as a host. I wasn't sure that I should address it to the whole group here. So I can read it here. And if Dr. Azza Karam would like to add any of her insights, it would be wonderful. So my question was, we need a kind of dialogue that can harness the power of religion to help humanity tackle its most challenging problems. There is a need for deep reflections on specific questions that I personally always try to focus on. And what is the potential of the spaces opened up in the name of interfaith dialogue? I totally believe in the hidden power of the interfaith dialogue. And we can see that among the world now, there are a variety of these spaces. So these questions can tackle people who are involved in these organizations to, really reflect as what is the potential of the spaces opened up in the name of interfaith dialogue? What are its aims and hopes today? How can we participate in a discourse that draws on the insights of religion, but goes further to explore their advances to a world that is more unified and more diverse? I think one of the aims of participation in interfaith dialogue is to draw out universal principles and learn from each other, because our religions are so rich, and there is one common goal in our religion, which is love and harmony. And respect for our inner humanity that we all share here. The point is to work toward a more peaceful and just world. In this sense, now here comes my question. How can you see religion as a system of knowledge and practice that can evolve and offer insights and values that can help society advance? I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a big question.
Yeah. You have something to say to that, for sure.
I think that showing up for each other is what you mentioned. It's not just the pause, it's the noticing who you're standing shoulder to shoulder with. And that's what the Tri-Faith Initiative was found on, that idea of solidarity, that we might not be able to fix what is broken in the world, but when we show up together, that's a model that works, and it works every single time, actually. And it works. It's something you can even do independently. That if you're in your heart and your head, you are showing up to learn about what's happening in the world, that counts. And I think sometimes we don't count enough of those moments and the compounding interest of showing up for and with each other, would be my answer.
And that is interfaith dialogue. I think it's interesting because if you look at so much of what we know and have learned today that we consider knowledge, to that very excellent point about religion being a source thereof, actually some of the most prolific scientists, artists have been men and women of faith, and they've gone to the source, so to speak, of their respective faith traditions to become enlightened and to enlighten others. So we know, for instance, that Galileo was very much resented by the church, but the man was a believer who was looking and learning from, in this case, the Bible, as it was known at that period of time, and his faith to also instruct and inform and learn about the universe. And that was what irritated the institution of the church most, was that this man was a heretic, even though he was using the knowledge that was inherent in his faith tradition to also inspire and to be informed and to instruct more of the science. So that there's always been an incredibly strong connection, if you think about it, between the origins of knowledge, the way that even the formulations of what constitutes knowledge, and faith systems, belief systems, the stories and narratives of old that are enshrined in all faiths around the world. And I think even today, when we look and are beginning to learn from indigenous men and women about their spirituality, which is also about botany, it's about the science of forests, the science of grass and trees and things that we consider objective science, but in fact they approach this is their sacred, this is their faith. So there's always been, I think, a very strong connection and symbiosis between knowledge and religion as we know it. But then I think what also has transpired is that over time, as we've sought to institutionalize everything we have, every ideology, every aspect of knowledge gets institutionalized over time. And as we've sought to institutionalize, we've lost a little bit of that, the spiritual connection and connectivity, the connection to the faith, to the religion, whatever, because the institutional is always, so I always think of institutions like prisons somehow. The minute you get an idea and you institutionalize it, you've imprisoned it. And it operates according to very different logic. And think about liberation theology. It came out of a very deep space of spiritual, but it was quintessentially activist and rights oriented and whatever. And the church resented it at that time because it was like, wait, you're taking it out of the bounds of this institution, because institutions imprison. If we're not careful, the institutions become the prisons of our ideas. Liberation movements that fought and many of their members died for the idea of liberation, the minute they become institutions, governments, we somehow lose the connection to that which was inspiring in the first place, to the ideology that had inspired in the first place. So I think institutions tend to do that if we're not careful, and all religions got institutionalized over time. So your point, I think, Ms. Farah, is very, very relevant in the fact that knowledge and religions are deeply interconnected, but the institutionalization of either can create that dissonance, the distance, and the barrier. Interfaith dialogue also got institutionalized. Right, so it became this organization, this department, this, and the irony, of course, is that interfaith dialogue is the quintessential coexistence modality. And the people of faith have always coexisted. So there's always been an interfaith dialogue. But it wasn't an organization. It wasn't this NGO. It wasn't this. Wasn't Religious for Peace. So therefore, is that interfaith dialogue? No, not really. Interfaith dialogue is what Religious for Peace does. Absolutely not. It's what you and I are doing. We're all of us doing it right now. This is interfaith dialogue. Living together as neighbors is interfaith dialogue.
Right. Okay, we're set up for me to just tell you a couple things related to what you just brought up. So Trifaith is hosting the first ever conference in Omaha, Nebraska on race, religion, and social justice. And just by chance, the theme this year is harm, healing, and hope, because of exactly what it is that Azza just said, that we have an opportunity and a need to name the harm of these institutions that our own institutions have contributed to, and that if we name the harm, we have a potential for healing and hope. Ali, do you think that you could help me out here and share a link to the conference in the chat? We are just put out as of yesterday a call for papers. The conference is on June 9th. It will happen on the Trifaith Commons. All are welcome. And I think it will be really a beautiful coming together. Thank you all for joining us today. We'd love your feedback. I did put a link in the chat to hear any suggestions or feedback or praise of our wonderful speaker today. Thank you for sharing yourself and for leading.
Thank you for doing
and
this.
for being so honest with us. I think that it's a really beautiful example.
Thank you for having
Be safe. Take care. Thank you.
There's so many friends. I know, there's so many names.